Today was just supposed to be another normal lunch break. Nothing more. I was out running errands, and, on a whim, I thought I'd stop by this cafe that Lisa and I used to love, thinking it might bring back some good memories. Honestly, we hadn't gone there together in months. It used to be our spot, but she always had something come up whenever I suggested going back. So here I am, sitting by the window with a coffee I don't even feel like drinking, just staring outside, watching people pass by. I don't know what came over me, but I picked up my phone to give her a call. The idea popped into my head. A quick surprise call, maybe just to hear her voice, just to see how her day was going. Maybe it would bring back a little spark that had been missing. I dialed her number, and as I lifted my phone to my ear, something caught my attention. Her ringtone was going off somewhere close. I didn't want to believe it, but it was coming from just a few feet away, at the next table over. I turned my head slowly, every second feeling stretched and surreal, like I was watching some twisted version of my own life play out in slow motion. And there she was right in front of me. Lisa was sitting at the table next to mine, not at the office like she'd said, but here, dressed in the blouse and pencil skirt she usually wore to work, leaning in close to some guy with a neatly trimmed beard and a smug grin on his face. My hand tightened around my phone as I watched her glance at the screen, my name lighting up her phone, and without a second thought, she declined my call. Just like that, she pressed decline with the kind of ease that told me she'd done it before. She looked right back at him and laughed, the kind of laugh she used to reserve for us when we were the only ones at the table, leaning in close, sharing little secrets. I stood up without thinking, and my chair scraped against the floor. Heads turned, but I didn't care. Her eyes met mine, and for a split second her face went pale. Then, just as quickly, she recovered. Her expression shifted to one I'd never seen before, defiant, almost challenging, like she was daring me to react. And him? He didn't look surprised at all. In fact, he looked amused. She didn't even try to explain. Just sat there, eyes locked on mine, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips as she crossed her arms, daring me to say something, as if I were the one intruding on her. "What the hell, Lisa?" I finally managed, my voice low but shaking with everything I was holding back. She didn't flinch, didn't stammer or apologize. Instead, she just tilted her head, giving me this look like I was the one who'd been caught doing something wrong. And then, calmly, she said, "I'm busy, Jason. Why don't you go home and we'll talk later?" "Busy?" I choked out, glancing at the guy sitting beside her. He leaned back, arms folded, watching us both like he was enjoying a show. The moment she said, "I'm busy," I felt something snap inside of me. It wasn't anger. It was a mix of disbelief and this raw, hollow feeling, like someone had scooped everything out of me and left me standing there, empty. But I wasn't going to just walk away. Not this time. "Busy doing what, Lisa?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "You told me you were at work." She rolled her eyes, this small, almost bored sigh slipping out of her, and I could feel my stomach drop. It was a look I'd seen on her face 100 times before, but it had never been directed at me. "Can we not do this right here?" she said, waving her hand dismissively, like I was embarrassing her. Meanwhile, the guy next to her just sat there, that stupid grin on his face like he was enjoying every second of this. "Sure, Lisa," I said, my voice low. "Where should we go? Or would you prefer I leave so you can keep doing whatever this is?" I gestured to her, and this guy, who still hadn't said a word, just sat there watching like it was the most entertaining thing he'd seen all week. She glanced at him, then back at me, and instead of any hint of remorse or explanation, she simply said, "Jason, you're overreacting." Overreacting? I could hardly believe my ears. Here I was, standing in the middle of this cafe, staring at my wife sitting across from some guy while I'm hearing the words, "You're overreacting," come out of her mouth. And her voice, it wasn't panicked or apologetic. It was calm, almost cold, like this was just another inconvenience, like I was an interruption to her day. "Why don't you just go, Jason?" she added, her tone dropping to a softer, patronizing pitch, as though she was helping me by suggesting it. I looked at her, trying to make sense of how the woman I'd spent years with could look at me with this kind of detachment, with no explanation, no hint of regret or shame. My mind was racing, heart pounding, and I could barely think straight. But I wasn't ready to let her off that easy. "Who is he?" I demanded, nodding at the guy next to her. He didn't even flinch, just kept staring at me with a casual, smug look on his face, like he knew something I didn't. She exchanged a glance with him, and for a split second, they both laughed. A shared laugh, one that was all too familiar, too intimate. My stomach twisted, and I could feel the heat rising in my face. Finally, she turned back to me and said, "If you really need to know, this is Connor. He's been around for a while." Around for a while? The words fell out of my mouth, echoing in my head as they left hers. It was so casual, like she was telling me about some random errand she'd run that I hadn't known about. She shrugged. "If you're going to make a scene, Jason, then yeah, maybe it's time you knew. Connor and we've been seeing each other. I thought you would have figured it out by now." Every word hit me like a punch. I felt like my whole body was burning, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. But those words, "I thought you would have figured it out by now," they echoed through me, mocking every memory we'd built together. Every late night, every quiet morning, every inside joke we'd ever shared. Suddenly, it felt like all of it had been a lie, some kind of twisted joke where I was the only one who didn't know the punchline. I looked at her, trying to find something in her eyes, anything that showed this was hitting her, too. But she just sat there, completely unaffected, her gaze locked on mine, almost daring me to do something about it. Connor, this guy who had come into my life without me even knowing, leaned back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the back of hers, the picture of relaxed confidence. "So this is it?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You're not even going to try to explain yourself?" "What's there to explain?" she replied, arching an eyebrow like I was asking something obvious. "We're adults, Jason. Things change. People drift apart." Drift apart? As if her sneaking around with some guy was the same as us quietly growing distant, like it was some natural consequence of life instead of a choice she'd made over and over. I clenched my fists, holding back the flood of things I wanted to say, to shout. But I forced myself to stay calm, to look at her, trying to see her for who she'd really become. "You lied to me," I said, my voice strained but steady. "You've been lying, Lisa, about everything. Why couldn't you just tell me if things were? If you wanted out?" At that, she finally reacted, her eyes narrowing slightly, her jaw tightening just a fraction. But then she looked away, rolling her eyes as though I'd asked something childish. "Because, Jason," she said, her tone dripping with irritation, "I didn't feel like dealing with the drama. You get so intense. I didn't want the confrontation, the endless questions. I just wanted to live my life without having to justify every single decision to you." Her words hit like ice, but they were nothing compared to what came next. She let out a slow, dismissive sigh, then turned her attention to Connor, completely ignoring me, as if I was nothing more than some noise she was tuning out. She reached over, resting her hand on his, a quiet, casual gesture, like they'd been doing this for years. And the worst part? He didn't look surprised or uncomfortable. He just smiled, giving her hand a small squeeze as if to reassure her, as if to let her know that whatever happened next, he'd be there. The way she looked at him, it was like I wasn't even there, like I didn't matter. I felt my stomach drop. It was that look she used to give me when we'd first started dating, that look that said, "I'm all yours." I took a step back, my head spinning, a mixture of anger, humiliation, and sheer disbelief making it impossible to even stand still. All I could think was that I'd spent years with this woman, shared everything, built a life together. And now, in the span of a few minutes, she was showing me a version of herself I'd never seen, never even imagined. And it was all for this stranger sitting across from her. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "You know what, Lisa?" I said, my voice shaking. "You can stay here with Connor. I hope he's everything you've been looking for. I really do." I turned to leave, my mind reeling. But before I took my first step, I heard her voice, calm and steady, cut through the air like a knife. "Oh, don't worry, Jason," she said, almost smirking. "He is." As I stumbled out of the cafe, my mind a mess of shattered memories and raw confusion, I barely noticed the people passing by. My legs moved on autopilot, but inside, I felt gutted, hollow. The woman I'd trusted with my whole life, the one I thought I knew better than anyone, had sat there with that stranger, Connor, and brushed me off like I was nothing. I don't know how long I wandered around before I ended up back at my car. I sat there for a while, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I replayed the scene in my mind over and over, hoping to find some clue that would make it all make sense. But each time, all I got was that cold, defiant look in her eyes as she told me I was overreacting, and that smug smile on his face, like he had somehow won. I wanted answers. If she wasn't going to explain, I'd figure it out myself. So, against every instinct telling me to get out of there, I decided to go home and dig for the truth. Maybe she'd left some clue, some sign that could tell me when, or why, she'd started hiding parts of herself away from me. The drive home was a blur, but when I got there, the house felt different. It wasn't my home anymore. It felt cold, almost foreign, like a set from a life I wasn't part of anymore. But I pushed that feeling aside. If Lisa thought she could keep me in the dark, she was wrong. I started with her desk. She'd always been meticulous about keeping it neat. Her notebooks lined up in perfect order, pens all arranged just so. But I noticed something odd right away. One of her drawers, which she usually kept locked, was slightly open. My heart pounded as I pulled it out and found her personal journal lying on top, partially buried under a stack of receipts and old birthday cards. I hesitated. This was her private journal, something I'd never considered reading, even in the worst of arguments. But I knew if I didn't get answers now, I'd never be able to look her in the eye again without questioning everything she said. So I opened it, my hands shaking, and flipped to the last few entries. And there it was, plain as day. Met Connor again tonight. It's getting harder to pretend with Jason. He just doesn't see what we have. Connor understands me in ways Jason never could. He knows what I need, doesn't ask me to be someone I'm not. Page after page, it went on like that. Words that cut deep, about how I was too predictable, how I smothered her, how she felt trapped in the life we'd built. She'd gone on, spilling out her resentment, her complaints, her justifications for betraying me. And every entry ended with a line about Connor, about how he made her feel free, how he got her, how she didn't feel the need to hide. I thought I was ready for the truth, but nothing could have prepared me for this. My hand shook as I turned to the last entry, written only a few nights ago. I know I need to tell Jason soon. He deserves to know, but I just can't handle his reaction. I don't want to hear his disappointment, his anger. I just want him to let go. I felt sick. She'd been planning to keep lying until she could somehow manipulate me into letting her go without a fight. The words on those pages haunted me. He deserves to know, as if she were doing me some kind of favor by keeping her affair a secret, like hiding her betrayal was somehow kinder. She'd been ready to sit across from me every day, knowing exactly what she was doing behind my back, waiting for me to just give up. My hands were shaking as I snapped her journal shut, the twisted reality of it all sinking in. This wasn't a simple mistake or some one-time thing. No, she'd spent months building a second life with him, all while watching me live in oblivion. I looked around the house, every corner filled with our memories, our life together, and realized how meaningless it all must have been to her. Every framed photo, every little shared memento. They'd been nothing more than props in a story she'd outgrown. I couldn't bear to look at them any longer. Still, the need to understand why gnawed at me. The journal hinted at her dissatisfaction, at some version of our marriage she found suffocating. But that wasn't the Lisa I thought I knew. So I kept searching, fueled by a morbid curiosity, a need to see exactly how deep her deception went. I headed to her closet next. I don't know what I was looking for, but some part of me was driven by the suspicion that there were more secrets hiding in plain sight. As I rummaged through her things, my hand brushed against a sleek, unfamiliar phone tucked at the back, behind a row of her blouses. My heart sank. She'd never mentioned a second phone. I unlocked it. Her passcode was our wedding date, and the bitter irony of that almost made me laugh. Messages filled the screen immediately. Some were to names I didn't recognize, but most were to him, Connor. I started scrolling through the texts, each one ripping open a fresh wound. They were graphic, intimate, full of inside jokes and late-night plans. She'd been meeting him more often than I could have imagined, sneaking out for hours, making excuses about work trips, family visits, anything that kept me from asking questions. But it was the last message that undid me completely. I think he's starting to get suspicious. I almost wish he'd catch us so I wouldn't have to pretend anymore. I'm so done with the act. The act, that's what she'd called us. Like the whole life we'd built, everything we'd shared, was just some performance she was putting on until she found something better. I dropped the phone, my mind racing, a sickening mixture of betrayal, rage, and something darker taking hold of me. Every memory, every promise we'd made, was tainted now. I stood there in the closet, clutching her second phone, feeling like I was falling through a trapdoor. The messages I'd read weren't just texts. They were a roadmap to her double life, each one peeling back a layer I'd never seen before. I couldn't believe that while I'd been planning our future, talking about vacations, maybe even kids someday, she'd been orchestrating an escape, one that involved someone else entirely. I needed air. I stumbled out of the closet and went downstairs, my thoughts spiraling as I tried to grasp how long she'd been living this lie. Every room I passed was a reminder of the life I thought we were building together, every photo on the wall mocking me with what I'd assumed was a real bond. I ended up in the kitchen, gripping the counter, staring blankly at the spot where we used to sit and have coffee in the mornings, laughing over the most trivial things. It was a ritual I'd loved, something I thought she cherished too. Now, knowing what I knew, I could almost hear her rehearsing her lines to me, playing her role while in her head, she was probably already miles away, already with him. The anger was starting to boil over, clouding my judgment, pushing me to do something, anything, to break through the numbness that was creeping in. I picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over her contact name, and called her. I wanted to hear her voice, to see if she'd have the nerve to keep up her act after everything I just uncovered. She answered on the second ring, her tone casual. "Hey Jason, what's up?" Her voice was so smooth, so practiced, as if she didn't have a care in the world. "I found it, Lisa," I said, my voice low and cold. "I found everything. The messages, the meetings, all the lies." There was a beat of silence on the other end. For a split second, I thought I'd finally caught her off guard. But then, without missing another beat, she laughed. An actual cold laugh. "Oh, Jason," she said, her voice laced with disdain, as if I were the naive one. "I figured you'd piece it together eventually. Took you long enough." Her words sliced right through me. She didn't sound the least bit remorseful, not even defensive. It was as if she'd finally been unmasked and didn't care. She'd been holding this card in her back pocket, just waiting to throw it down when I got too close to the truth. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice thick with everything I was holding back. "You've been lying to my face for months, and this is how you react? You don't even care." "Why should I?" she snapped, her tone hardening. "Jason, I don't owe you an apology. If you weren't so suffocating, maybe I wouldn't have had to go looking for something else." Suffocating? I could barely recognize my own voice, the anger and disbelief twisting it into something unrecognizable. "I've given you everything. You didn't have to lie, Lisa. You could have told me. But you chose to play me for a fool." She sighed, exasperated, as if I was the one being unreasonable. "Jason, I don't need a lecture from you. You and I were done a long time ago. You just didn't realize it." And then she said the one thing I'd never thought I'd hear from her. "Let it go, Jason. Move on. Just move on." She hung up, leaving me standing there, the silence echoing through the house. Her words, "Move on," rang in my ears, almost mocking me in their finality. Couldn't believe it. I'd spent years with this woman, shared everything, built what I thought was a life worth fighting for. And she was telling me to move on, as if we'd been nothing more than casual strangers. I stood there, feeling the sharp, cold edges of the house around me. This place I once called home, now just a shell. Every part of it felt like a reminder of how blind I'd been, how thoroughly she'd pulled the wool over my eyes. I could still see her on our couch, curled up under the blanket, laughing at some dumb movie we'd watched 100 times. But now I realized she'd been laughing at me, at my ignorance, at the trust I'd handed over so freely. I sat down on the couch, staring blankly ahead, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I thought back to all the excuses she'd given me over the last few months, how I'd been stupid enough to believe her every single time. The late nights at the office, the girls' trips with her friends I'd never met, the phone calls she'd take in the other room, saying they were work emergencies. Every moment we'd spent apart felt like another moment she'd given to him. Anger was swirling inside me, raw and unfiltered, but so was something darker. Humiliation. I'd been so completely blindsided, made to look like a fool in my own life, and I'd been too wrapped up in trusting her to see it. The thought made my blood boil. But in that anger, a spark of clarity hit me. If she thought she could walk away from this unscathed, she was wrong. I wasn't about to just disappear quietly from her life like she wanted, like it would be some easy way for her to start over with him. No, I wanted her to understand what she'd done, to see how deeply she'd betrayed the man who had loved her without question. I went back to her journal, flipping through it with a new focus, looking for anything. Any hint of what she'd planned next, of what she and Connor were intending. She'd been careful, though. The journal entries were careful not to mention his full name or anything specific about him, almost as if she was preparing to keep everything under wraps in case I found out. But then I remembered the second phone. I grabbed it from where I tossed it in the closet and sat down with it, scrolling back through the messages with Connor, this time reading more slowly. I was looking for anything that might give me some leverage, something that would make her understand that I wasn't just going to move on. And then I found it, a thread of messages where they discussed meeting up at a hotel nearby. It was dated just last weekend, when she told me she was away for a corporate conference. They hadn't even been careful. The message thread laid it all out. Details of their weekend, the things they planned to do, all in explicit, taunting detail. One line from her stuck out like a dagger to the chest. Finally, a weekend where I don't have to pretend. Can't wait to spend every second with you. I took a shaky breath, the betrayal cutting fresh all over again. But I knew what I had to do now. I wasn't going to beg her to stay or give her a single tear. No, I'd take her words at face value. I'd move on. But not without letting her feel the weight of what she'd destroyed. I started making plans. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was her sitting in that cafe, laughing at me with Connor as if I were nothing more than some joke she'd already outgrown. But if she thought she'd won, she was wrong. I wasn't going to just fade out of her life quietly, giving her a clean slate with him. No, I was going to make sure she faced every ugly consequence of what she'd done. The next morning, I went to my office, shut the door, and started gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I printed out her messages from that second phone and scanned the most incriminating entries from her journal. She'd written openly about wanting to leave, how she felt alive with him, and worst of all, how she'd been planning to take a chunk of our savings when she left. She'd even written a rough draft of a goodbye letter, one where she painted herself as the victim, saying she'd felt unfulfilled in our marriage, that I'd held her back, and that she was finally brave enough to seek the life she really wanted. The audacity of it made my stomach turn. After I had everything compiled, I contacted my lawyer. If Lisa was going to pull the rug out from under me, I'd make sure she wasn't leaving with anything more than the clothes on her back. I explained the situation to my lawyer, laying out the proof, and we began drafting a strategy that would leave no stone unturned. I wanted a divorce, and I wanted her to feel the sting of every single lie she told. But I wasn't done yet. I knew her family well, especially her parents. Her father had always admired me, respected the life I'd built for myself, and had even once said he was grateful Lisa had found someone who'd treat her well. I couldn't let her manipulate them with that goodbye letter she'd been drafting. So I made copies of her journal entries and messages to Connor and sent them in a neat envelope to her parents. I kept my message to them brief. I thought you should know what's really been going on with Lisa. This has been happening for months, right under my nose. I know how close you are, and I wanted you to see the truth before she twists it into something it isn't. You've always been like family to me, and I respect you too much to let her lie to you. I sent it and waited. The whole time, I was bracing for the moment she would discover what I'd done. It didn't take long. Later that evening, my phone lit up with her name, and I picked it up, ready for whatever storm was coming. Jason, what the hell did you do? Her voice was shrill, shaking with an anger I'd never heard from her before. Oh, so now you care? I replied calmly, savoring the irony. Funny, you didn't seem to care yesterday, or any of the nights you spent with Connor. You sent my parents. She stopped, almost choking on her words. You don't understand. They're furious with me. You're trying to ruin my life. Ruin your life? I repeated, my voice filled with quiet satisfaction. No, Lisa. I'm just exposing the truth. You made the choices, and now you get to face them. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her scrambling for control, reaching for anything that would turn this back in her favor. Jason, please, can we just talk about this? Without lawyers, without dragging my family into it. No, Lisa, I said firmly. We've talked enough. Now I'm done with you, and you're going to start facing the consequences you tried to avoid. I hung up and set my phone down, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. She wasn't going to manipulate her way out of this, and she wasn't going to twist the truth anymore. She wanted to be free from me? Fine. But I'd make sure she'd have to live with the truth following her every step of the way. The silence after I hung up was deafening. I sat there, the reality settling in. I'd taken control back. For the first time since this nightmare began, I wasn't drowning in questions, wondering how she could do this. I'd laid it out for her family, for the lawyers. She'd woven a web of lies, but I'd shredded every thread. The next morning, my lawyer called me with an update. Jason, we're making headway, he said, sounding sharper and more focused than usual. Given the evidence, we have a solid case for a favorable divorce settlement. She won't be getting anything more than what's absolutely necessary. He paused, then added, she's tried reaching out to negotiate directly, but I've advised her counsel that all communication goes through us. We're taking this one by the book. I felt a sense of satisfaction hearing that she'd tried to bypass the process. Typical Lisa, always needing control, always needing to feel she could manage every situation. But now, she was finally dealing with boundaries she couldn't twist, excuses that wouldn't fly. Felt satisfying. Then my phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. Jason, it's Connor. We need to talk. Don't ignore me. I stared at the message, my chest tightening. I didn't owe this guy anything, not even a reply, but curiosity, and maybe a bit of anger, got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I replied, what could you possibly have to say? Seconds later, his response came through. Meet me tonight at O'Malley's. 7 p.m. You'll want to hear this. I clenched my jaw, hesitating. The last thing I wanted was to meet this guy face to face. But some part of me couldn't resist. Maybe he had some truth to offer. A way to help me understand just what she'd been thinking. What they'd both been thinking. Or maybe he was desperate, scrambling to do damage control now that Lisa's life was unraveling. Either way, I needed to know. That evening, I walked into O'Malley's, spotting him instantly at a booth in the back, nursing a beer. Connor looked just as smug as I remembered from the cafe, but there was an edge to his expression, like he wasn't quite as confident as he wanted to appear. I slid into the seat across from him, not bothering with small talk. So, I said, folding my arms, what's this about? He leaned forward, his gaze steady but shadowed. Look, Jason, I'm not here to stir up trouble, but Lisa's going to crash and burn, and I don't want to be dragged down with her. Good for you, I said dryly. Why should I care? Because, he said, pausing as if choosing his words carefully. There's more to this than you know. Lisa, she's not the woman you think she is. I thought I was the only one who understood her, but now I see. She uses people, Jason. She used me, just like she's used you. I felt a strange mix of anger and validation hearing that. Welcome to the club, I replied. But I already knew that. So why am I here? He shifted, his confidence cracking just a little. She's trying to pin the blame on me, saying I pressured her, that I seduced her into it. She's telling her family that I manipulated her, that it was all some huge mistake. Sounds like the consequences of your choices are catching up to you, I said, feeling a grim satisfaction. He rubbed his temples, looking almost desperate. She's already cut me off. Told her family she wants nothing to do with me now that everything's falling apart. She's saving her own skin, and she's ready to throw me under the bus. I just thought you should know what kind of person you were really dealing with. I met his eyes, feeling nothing but cold detachment. I know exactly what kind of person she is, Connor, and now you do too. He slumped back, realization dawning on his face. For the first time, I saw regret flicker in his eyes. "You made your bed," I said, standing up to leave. "Now lie in it." As I walked out of O'Malley's, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. I thought meeting Connor might dredge up more anger, or maybe even bring some kind of twisted closure. But what I'd gotten instead was a glimpse of the emptiness that Lisa had left in her wake. She'd not only destroyed our marriage, but had also manipulated the very person she'd betrayed me for, discarding him as soon as things got complicated. She was like a storm, tearing through everything and everyone in her path without a second thought. By the time I got home, I was exhausted but strangely clear-headed. I knew what I needed to do next. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because I wanted my life back. A real life free from her games, her manipulation, and her betrayal. The following morning, I packed up everything that was hers. I took her clothes from the closet, her shoes, her jewelry, anything that tied her to this place. I wanted her gone, out of my life for good. I put it all in boxes and stacked them by the front door, like a scene from some movie, except this wasn't Hollywood drama. This was my real life, and I wasn't about to let her shadow linger in it any longer than necessary. But as I went through the last of her things, I found one final reminder of how blind I'd been. It was a small photo album, tucked behind some old papers. I flipped it open and found pictures of us on our honeymoon, on vacations, at family gatherings. There was Lisa, smiling, her arms wrapped around me, looking for all the world like she was genuinely happy. And for a moment, I felt the sting of what could have been, a flash of sadness for the life I thought we had. But then I remembered everything she'd said, everything she'd done, and the sadness quickly turned to resolve. The Lisa in those photos was just a mask, another act. I knew that now, and I wasn't going to let her ghost haunt me. I put the album in the box with the rest of her things and shut the lid, sealing it all away. With everything packed, I picked up my phone and texted her. "Your things are ready for pickup. I want them gone by tomorrow." I expected her to respond with anger or a feeble attempt at more excuses. But instead, she texted back almost immediately, with a response that showed me just how little remorse she had. "Thanks, Jason. I'll get them out of your way. I'm glad you're moving on." No apology, no regret, not a hint of acknowledgement for the pain she'd caused. Just another convenient exit line for her. I put my phone down, realizing that was probably the last time I'd ever hear from her. And strangely, I felt relief wash over me. The next day, she came by while I was out, and by the time I got home, the boxes were gone. All traces of her, gone. The house felt empty, but in a way that felt freeing. She'd taken enough from me. My trust, my peace of mind, but I wasn't about to let her take one thing more. This was my life, and from now on, it would be one I built for myself, one free from her lies. Finally, as the last piece of her was lifted from my life, I knew I was ready to move forward. With Lisa gone and her things finally out of my life, I thought I'd feel free, fully, deeply relieved. And in some ways, I did. But the silence was also sharper than I'd expected. A kind of heavy quiet that made the house feel like a stranger's. I spent the next few days going through the motions, trying to settle back into a rhythm. But everything reminded me of the time I'd lost, the plans we'd made that were now hollow. I couldn't shake the sense that I'd been walking around in some kind of trance for years, blind to the reality of who Lisa had really been. Friends started to call, sensing something was off, and I debated how much to tell them. Some had known Lisa well, others barely at all, but they all asked the same questions, tiptoeing around the subject, trying to be supportive without prying too much. Finally, I opened up to a few of them, laying out the entire story. The reactions varied, from anger to disappointment, even to relief. One of my oldest friends, Mark, just listened in stunned silence before saying, "Jason, I always thought you two were solid, but man, maybe it's better you found out now rather than later." That stuck with me. Now rather than later. As if every year I'd invested was another step into a deeper lie, one I'd never have come back from if I'd discovered it years down the line. It made me see just how far gone she really was. She'd already started building an exit, rewriting the story of our life as something she could leave in the dust. It was on one of those quieter, emptier nights that I got an unexpected message. It was from Lisa's father, Michael. We'd always been close, especially during the early years of my relationship with Lisa. He was a strong, no-nonsense type, the kind of person who never tolerated excuses and could see through almost anything. I could only imagine how he'd reacted after seeing the envelope I'd sent him. "Jason, can we talk? I know it might be awkward, but I feel like I owe you something," the message read. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to leave Lisa and everyone connected to her behind, but another part of me respected him too much to brush him off. So I agreed to meet him for coffee the next morning. When I arrived, Michael was already sitting there, nursing his coffee, looking older than I remembered. He glanced up, and when he saw me, his face softened, a pained look flashing through his eyes. "Jason," he said, standing to shake my hand. "Thanks for meeting me. I know you probably want nothing to do with us after everything." I sat down, shaking my head. "You're not the one who did this, Michael. None of this is on you." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I appreciate you saying that, but I still feel responsible. Like I should have seen something, maybe warned you." He looked down at his coffee, collecting his thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his voice thick with regret. "She wasn't always like this. When she met you, I thought she'd changed, that she'd finally found someone who could bring out the best in her. But over time, I started to see signs, small things I didn't want to believe. I convinced myself that it was just her being headstrong. But looking back, I think I knew." I clenched my jaw, absorbing his words. It hurt, but at the same time, it was oddly comforting to know that I wasn't the only one who'd been fooled, who'd believed in a version of her that didn't really exist. "I should have been honest with you, Jason," he continued. "But I wanted to believe she was different with you, and she should have been. You were good to her. You gave her everything." He paused, his face clouded with sadness. "I'm sorry." His apology, sincere and full of the remorse that Lisa had never shown, was unexpectedly healing. I felt a weight lift, a part of the hurt softening. He hadn't been the one who'd lied to me, but in his way, he was acknowledging the pain she'd caused, the life she'd broken apart. And he was showing the kind of regret she never would. "Thank you, Michael," I said finally. "It helps to hear this from you." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us trying to make sense of the person we'd both lost in our own ways. Finally, he looked up at me, his eyes steady. "You'll get through this, Jason. You're stronger than she ever deserved." I left that cafe feeling something close to peace. It wasn't full closure, but it was a step forward. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. After that meeting with Michael, I felt the beginnings of something I hadn't experienced in weeks, a kind of clarity. It was a faint spark, like the first light after a storm, but it was there. He'd given me what Lisa never could, an honest acknowledgement of the damage she'd left behind. And that acknowledgement, strange as it felt, was like a balm on an open wound. I went home that evening and took a long, hard look at everything around me. The house was filled with remnants of our life together, things I hadn't had the heart to go through yet. Her coffee mug still sat in the cabinet next to mine. Her favorite book lay on the nightstand. All those small, ordinary things that, in their own quiet way, marked the years we'd spent here. They used to feel like pieces of home. Now, they felt like artifacts from a story I didn't recognize anymore. I took a deep breath, grabbed a few empty boxes, and started packing. Each item felt heavy in my hands, carrying memories that had once been precious, but were now laced with the sting of betrayal. I packed the mug, the books, the photos, every item that felt tied to her, to us. I'd kept these things around, maybe hoping I'd one day see them and feel nothing but nostalgia. But I knew now that I'd never find peace surrounded by reminders of someone who'd left me so deeply scarred. I reached the last room in the house, the small office that Lisa and I had shared over the years. There, on the desk, sat a framed picture I hadn't looked at in weeks. It was one from our anniversary last year. She and I laughing, leaning into each other, looking for all the world like the perfect couple. I stared at it, feeling a bitter knot tighten in my chest. I'd been so sure back then that we were unbreakable, that we were stronger than the small arguments, the daily grind, the challenges of any marriage. But now I could see the truth in her eyes, a hollowness I hadn't noticed before, masked by that bright smile she'd perfected. I ran my thumb over the glass, taking one last look at the couple in the frame, then carefully slid the photo out, folded it, and placed it in the box with everything else. As I taped the last box shut, a strange calm settled over me. This was it. I was clearing her out of my life, making space for something new, something that would be truly mine with no shadow of betrayal hanging over it. When I finally set the last box aside, I sat down on the edge of the bed, taking in the unfamiliar emptiness of the house. It was silent, but for the first time that silence felt peaceful. Felt like a clean slate. I didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but I knew one thing. I was no longer trapped in the ruins of our marriage, haunted by the memories of someone who hadn't truly been there. I lay back, staring at the ceiling, feeling a sense of relief and freedom that I hadn't felt in months. For so long, I'd been clinging to the hope that I could fix things, that I could salvage what was left of us. But now, as I lay there, I realized I didn't need her or anyone to feel whole again. I was stronger than that, and that, I realized, was my new beginning. The next few days I found myself navigating an unfamiliar calm. The house was quiet and bare, but somehow it felt more like home than it had in years. Without her presence looming in every corner, I could breathe again, think clearly, even begin to envision a future I hadn't let myself imagine before. There was a strange power in it, in knowing I was building something new, a life that was solely mine. I started making small changes. I moved furniture, rearranged rooms, bought new sheets, even painted one of the walls in the living room a color Lisa had hated, but I'd always wanted, a deep, calming blue. It was a small act, but it felt like reclaiming my space, piece by piece. Friends began dropping by more often, checking in on me, sometimes bringing a beer or just staying for a quick chat. They'd tell me stories about their own relationships, small trials, things they'd overcome together, and I found myself starting to appreciate what real honesty and partnership looked like. Then one night, Mark, my oldest friend, came over with a six-pack and a smirk. "Jason," he said, sitting down and cracking open a beer, "I think it's time you got back out there, or at least got out of this house. No offense, but I think it's suffocating you." I laughed, shaking my head. "You think I'm ready for that? Because I'm not so sure. Look, I'm not saying go out and fall in love tomorrow, but just start living again. Go out, take a trip, do something for you. No strings, no expectations. Just a chance to feel alive again." His words hung in the air, striking a chord that had been buried deep. I'd been so focused on moving past Lisa, on shedding the anger and betrayal, that I hadn't even thought about what came next. But now, sitting there, the idea of something new, a fresh start, a chance to rediscover who I was outside of that marriage, felt thrilling. Mark was right. I didn't need to plunge into anything serious, but I did need to reclaim the life that Lisa had stolen from me. The next day, I booked a weekend trip to a small town a few hours away, somewhere quiet, where I could hike, clear my head, maybe even meet new people who knew nothing about the baggage I was carrying. It was a step toward healing, toward finding my own path again, without looking back. When I arrived at the cabin I'd rented, surrounded by mountains and open sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Real, undisturbed peace, free of the tension and doubt that had been gnawing at me for months. I spent the next few days hiking, reading, and breathing in the clean, cool air, letting every step on the trail lead me further from the hurt I'd left behind. One evening, as I sat by a crackling fire, watching the stars emerge above the trees, I realized that this was what I'd been missing all along. The feeling of truly being grounded, anchored in something real and steady, and the freedom to build something meaningful out of the ashes of what I'd left behind. And for the first time, I knew I was going to be okay. On my last day at the cabin, I woke up early, just as the sun was cresting over the mountains. The morning air was crisp, and everything felt new, like the world had somehow shifted overnight. I packed my things, taking one last look around before closing the door, feeling grateful for the quiet transformation I'd found here. This trip, this time to myself, had done something I couldn't fully explain. It had stripped away the last traces of resentment and fear, leaving me with a clarity that felt solid and real. Driving home, I felt a strange mix of anticipation and peace. This time, the emptiness of the house wouldn't feel like loss but like possibility. It was a blank slate, a space that could be filled with new experiences, new people, new dreams. The pain Lisa had left in her wake was finally giving way to something deeper, a renewed trust in myself and in the life I wanted to create. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the mailbox was full, Mostly junk, a few bills, but among the pile was a plain white envelope with no return address. I opened it cautiously, my pulse quickening as I read the single page inside. It was from Lisa. Jason, I don't expect you to forgive me. I know I hurt you, and I don't have excuses that would mean anything now. I thought I could find what I was missing, but instead, I lost the one person who truly believed in me. I wish I'd realized it sooner. Maybe someday you can forgive me, but I won't ask you to. I only hope you find happiness, even if it's without me. Lisa. I stood there in the doorway, reading her words again, but they felt empty, like an echo of something that used to matter. I didn't feel anger or sadness anymore, only a distant sympathy for the woman who'd left so much wreckage behind her. She'd chosen her path and I'd chosen mine, and the two would never intersect again. I set the letter aside and walked into my home, my own home, and took a deep breath. For the first time in months, it felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of what had happened. The betrayal, the lies, the hurt, they were all part of my past, but they didn't define me. Not anymore. In the weeks that followed, I found myself embracing the small, quiet joys that came with rebuilding. I painted the remaining walls, brought in plants, cooked new recipes, and started taking long evening walks through the neighborhood, nodding to neighbors I'd never really known. I filled the house with music, laughter with friends, and the lightness of my own company. Piece by piece, my life took shape, a reflection of who I truly was, unclouded by anyone else's expectations or deceit. The pain Lisa had caused would always be a part of my story, a chapter that had reshaped me in ways I couldn't ignore. But it was just one chapter, and I had the rest of the story to write. I was free, truly, finally free, to live on my own terms without apologies or regrets. And that freedom was something no one could ever take from me again.